Welcome to WG University Weber Gallagher's series of educational programs. This is a special edition of our WG University webinar series. I'm Rick Ranieri, and I'm presenting today with Tim Stalker from our Philadelphia office. If you would like to view this webinar again, share it with others, or see our other WG University programs, please visit the Weber Gallagher website, www.wglaw.com, and you will find copies of this presentation and others under the WG University page. Also, feel free to contact the firm with any questions at questions@wglaw.com. Today's presentation is Fallout from the Monsanto Roundup Verdicts, Present and Future Impact of Glyphosate's Health Risks, Litigation, and Coverage Issues. Let's get started. The first thing I wanted to say to kind of set the stage for this talk is that we started looking at some of these issues going back almost 6 or 8 years now, when we first started considering potential claims and litigation risks for GMO foods, genetically modified foods. And those claims really didn't go anywhere, if you will. There were some class action false advertising claims and some minor property damage claims in other parts of the country. But it wasn't until it morphed into what we're seeing on the television today with this glyphosate Roundup litigation and the mass tort litigation it's become against Monsanto right now only, that we're now seeing a situation that may evolve into something that is substantially different than anything perhaps we've seen before, but maybe something very much identical to something that we've all lived with before. And Tim and I have talked quite a bit about, and that is my belief that there's a lot about the asbestos claims history and litigation history, and that whole model that has certain similarities to this glyphosate Roundup litigation. Now, what is glyphosate? As you can see, it was first synthesized in 1950. Monsanto really was the first company and the only company. They got the patent initially, and they created from a glyphosate base a mixture of proprietary compounds with glyphosate that ultimately became the product Roundup, which is a weed-killing agent and an herbicide. And as you can see, starting in 1974, they started directly marketing it under the brand name Roundup. Now, the way glyphosate, or really Roundup in this instance, works is that it is an herbicide. It's used to kill the bad weeds or the noxious plants, as you sometimes see that term used in some of the agribusiness areas. And it's applied almost exclusively by spraying, either manually held sprayers or larger motorized sprayers. And it can also be crop dusted, although that is not a favored use and is banned in most areas. And you can see at the bottom of this slide that even though Roundup has been around since the mid-70s, it wasn't until GMO crops really started to come into the marketplace in a big way in 1996 that you saw the real expansion of the use, not just in the agribusiness world, but in the home use and public lands, parks, golf courses, etc. And you see how there's been kind of a meteoric rise in the quantity of the amount, the frequency of application, and the almost universal types of uses or application sites that has been used in the for this Roundup product in a relatively short period of time. Now, the dangers of glyphosate, or really what we're talking about here, is the Roundup mix of products to include glyphosate, are claimed to be many. All right, you're going to hear us talk about things where there is the fear of glyphosate contamination in our food products, causing personal injury to humans by the ingestion of the food products contaminated with glyphosate. And also, like you'll see in some of these key verdicts that have come in recently, the injury caused by direct exposure while applying the Roundup products in home gardening or commercial settings. The next bar down, that yellow bar, talks about trade secrets preventing understanding of combined elements. That issue really has come to the forefront in this initial litigation because Monsanto, and now Bayer, who bought Monsanto, has a proprietary mix, and they did not want to reveal what the elements of that mix was. And the experts for the plaintiffs in these cases claimed that, the old expression, a dose equals a poison. Well, in this case, or in these cases, the argument is that the mix equals a poison. That is, that the Roundup mix is much more potentially carcinogenic than glyphosate by itself. And the next bar down talks about the fact that even though Roundup was initially developed and more heavily used and marketed for application on GMO crops that were raised to be Roundup resistant so that the crops wouldn't be killed, just the bad weeds would be killed. Starting in, I believe it was the mid-1980s, there were growers in Scotland who realized that there was a way to what they call dry the crops, that basically allows the crops to be brought to harvest-ready condition, and uniformly so across the growing fields, by spraying the as yet not totally mature crop with Roundup that would, in essence, goose the drying process, and then it could be harvested more quickly and more completely. And then, of course, what that would do is it would put on, whether it was a GMO crop or not, it would put a coating of this glyphosate Roundup product on top of these crops that would then be sent to a grinding mill or what have you. And while most of the spraying occurs in the typical mass crops of soy and corn, wheat, etc., what is happening is that through either bad agri practices or for other reasons, it's now not being contained to just those areas, but you find it in the feed that's going to the livestock, in processed foods like we talked about a moment ago, and then, of course, getting out into the waters through runoff, etc. The reason why glyphosate Roundup is considered to be, or feared to be by certain groups, bad for humans is that this herbicide is basically an antibiotic. Glyphosate was actually first invented or discovered as a degreasing agent, much like a benzene or a toluene. It was then later on determined that it could be an herbicide agent. But you can see that the reasons why it's effective in the field many of the reasons why we perhaps don't want it inside our bodies. Things like immune deficiency and endocrine disruption, and of course the cancer risk that we've all heard about. And there's good metals and bad metals in our body, and Roundup is a metal chelating compound that strips not just perhaps the bad metals out of our body, but unfortunately some of the good metals out of our body as well. Now, is it safer than table salt? Well, perhaps experts for Monsanto would argue that, but again, it's not so much an argument about whether glyphosate itself is particularly harmful, because glyphosate by itself, some would say, is relatively benign, but it's when it's mixed with these other proprietary products that it's then alleged to be carcinogenic. The issues that we're hearing about in the television commercials right now, and in these cases that we're going to talk about in a moment, involve, number one, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, as well as most recently, there was just a study that came out this week that talks about the liver and the negative impact and potential liver tissue destroying aspects of Roundup exposure. The antibiotic imbalance caused by having these products in our system are becoming more and more well known as a general population becomes more health conscious, and it is alleged by at least the advocacy groups who are spearheading the anti-Roundup, anti-glyphosate program to have these negative connotations that you see on the screen there. This next slide shows the absolute universal impact or potential spread of the potential contamination of products in almost every aspect of consumer goods you can think of. And there's everything from Dasani water in the bottom left of your screen to Cheerios and other breakfast cereals at the top of your screen. There's candy on there, there's ice cream, chewing gum, you name it. And there was a study done recently that the most highest concentration of glyphosate in parts per billion was actual original Cheerios. And as many of you know, that's a very popular food to give children, and all of the issues that go along with that. There also, as I mentioned earlier, are these false advertising and misleading advertising claims. One of the top products on the highest concentration chart is products under the 365 label, which I believe is a Whole Foods brand, which is marketed as organic, but they were on the upper list. Now, when you look to not just the impact in the consumer products and the ingestion of these products, but also the impact to the environment generally, what you see is that there has been over a 300-fold increase from 1974 through the last 10 years of the spraying in the US. And as I mentioned earlier, that's not just agricultural spraying, but it's all applications, that there's been a meteoric rise in the amount that's been used right up through present day. This leads to issues that we think about from like the environmental arena with runoff to rivers and streams, evaporation up into the cloud cover. The U.S. Geologic Service survey did a study, I believe that was 2 years ago, that found over 75% of the rainwater samples across the Midwest of the U.S. tested positive for glyphosate. So this impact is growing and spreading at a meteoric rate. And you see the reference on the next bullet point on this slide to the evolution of superweeds. What happened was when Roundup started to be used more and more to get rid of the bad weeds started to evolve to be Roundup resistant themselves. So then there was a development of, I forget the exact name, but a super Roundup, if you will. And essentially what it does is it cocktails Roundup with one of the main elements of Agent Orange. And some of us are old enough to remember the Agent Orange issues from way back, but it works really great. It takes care of a lot of weeds. And then the last bullet point is that there are certain impacts to the environment that we're not even fully aware of or capable of measuring yet. But there's at least anecdotal evidence that the butterfly populations, the honeybee populations, and even the bats populations are being substantially affected and killed off in large amounts, allegedly due to being contaminated by or coming into contact with this Roundup and glyphosate product. And what that does is that these animals or insects are very important to the whole pollination process. So there's more potential impacts down the road from those sorts of issues. The next slide, one of the things I really want to underscore is on the second bullet point there. I personally feel, and Tim and I were talking about this earlier, that parks, public spaces, the spraying along the sides, of interstates, but especially golf courses. I think that we're going to see a big explosion of claims, whether it's claims for coverage or actual claims, underlying litigation claims related to golf courses and the use of Roundup type products on golf courses and the surrounding properties. There are many properties, especially in the South, where you have these golf course communities where private homes are built right in and around each hole of the golf course. So something to keep in mind. The next group, if you will, because right now everyone's talking about Monsanto and Bayer, who bought Monsanto, but think about the big agricultural operations, the sprayers, the food manufacturers, public works entities. We mentioned spraying on public lands, the distributors of this product, right down to perhaps, again, borrowing from the asbestos model, the companies that sell Roundup, like a Walmart or a Lowe's, Home Depot type operation, or the companies that make the jugs that the Roundup is sold to the public in. We've already covered some of the new studies that are coming out. There seem to be studies coming out every week about potential connections of other cancers and other diseases linked to glyphosate exposure. We talked about liver. There's kidney studies going on right now, but things like gluten intolerance, dementia, obesity, reproductive and birth defect issues. There was just a rat study that was published within the last month that dealt with the generational skipping potential impact on birth defects and other cancers, where the pregnant mother is exposed daily to glyphosate in her diet. She tests essentially negative, her children test essentially negative, but her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren have higher than normal exceedances on things like birth defects and cancers. So these are some of the studies that are driving the latest scientific aspect to all of this. With the scientific aspect brings us to the regulatory aspect. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if you were to draw a line on that chart from the word corn straight down, and then just looked at the graph beyond that, moving forward in time, because corn, what this is when each of these big agri-crops really came onto the market, especially the GMO crops. And corn, alfalfa, and sugar, this is the big foodstuffs crops. And you see that the graph goes almost straight up from there as far as glyphosate Roundup usage. But turning to the regulatory aspect of this part of this talk, what got all of this litigation started was a report that came out of the IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer. They're actually a subdivision of the WHO, the World Health Organization, which is part of the UN. And the IARC, what their whole reason for being is that they don't do risk assessments per se. They do what they call hazard assessments. They look at all of the possible things in our entire universe that is planet Earth that could cause cancer, not whether something is necessarily a likely cause of cancer. And then they rank them, or they categorize them between known, probable, or possible. And in March of 2015, the IARC issued a report. What they really did was they issued a report with a summary to the report. And in the summary to the report, they say that glyphosate and its Roundup mix is, quote, probably carcinogenic to humans, close quote. And this one phrase and that summary section of the report is what launched all this litigation and brought us to where we are today with all of this litigation. But if you actually look at the report itself, not just what's stated in the summary, which says that there's limited evidence of human carcinogenic impact, but we found that there was sufficient evidence in the animal testing, which is really the rats that I mentioned earlier, but this was earlier rat testing, and that there was strong evidence of genotoxicity. But if you look at the body of the report, what the body of the report says is that there's only limited evidence of cancer, even in the most heavily dosed community, the agricultural workers or ag workers, for prostate cancer and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. But they went on to further state that they did not determine or make any finding whatsoever about a specific mechanism or causal relationship between exposure to glyphosate and Roundup and these findings in the ag workers of prostate cancer and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And they also didn't set a harmful level of exposure for these products. There has been a lot of criticism by both sides of the science, the reporting on the science, and the lobbying to the various regulatory agencies, the consumer groups and the plaintiffs groups on the one side and Monsanto on the other side, about the efficacy of this testing and the legitimacy of the opinions raised by this or reached as part of this testing. But one of the things that this next slide is directly mentioned in the body of the IARC report, where they did a large study, a 50,000 person ag worker study that found no association between solid tumors or what they call lymphoid malignancies, including non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And that while they said that there was some increased risk evidence for AML, in the highest exposed group, that they still felt that evidence needed further confirmation. And the WHO, which is the parent company or parent organization of the IARC, did not state that the IARC study led to the need for more regulation of glyphosate. But despite that, the groups and the plaintiffs' bar had their soundbite from the IARC, and that's what they went with. Turning to the FDA continues to study the effects and the complaints about glyphosate in food products. The only tests that up to late 2018 that the FDA had were really involved only pesticides. This is an herbicide. But when they used those pesticide tests on this herbicide, they still found that the vast majority were without any detectable levels whatsoever, even when they're looking at the main grain crops and the balance, the other, 47%, were still well below acceptable safety limits. And then you say, well, what does that really mean about acceptable safety limits? So you turn to OSHA, right? So that's worker safety, and they're supposed to set levels of worker exposure safety. And as late as the end of 2018, OSHA had still not developed any permissible exposure limit, or PEL or PEL, and the TLV, the threshold limit value, the ACGIH, still no levels established yet. And even the California OSHA has not set, as of the end of 2018, a worker exposure level. Same thing with NIOSH. If you turn to the EPA, and there's a lot here on the EPA, and we could spend a whole talk on the EPA, but suffice it to say that the EPA has looked at this because of political pressure brought to bear by both sides on the EPA, starting as early as 1993, and then again in 12, and in 15, and in 17, and now in 19. And you can see as you read down this slide that the first time they looked at it, not carcinogenic. The second time they look at it, which was a worst case, basically eating glyphosate sprayed products as your entire diet, your entire lifetime, they still said no adverse health effects would be expected. In 2015, they start another review of the alleged toxicity. 2017, they still say likely not carcinogenic. 2019, they're looking at it again. By the end of 19, they're supposed to come out with their final findings for this most recent study. But in late April, early May of 19, the EPA came out with some initial findings of a draft report for the 19 study, and they said it's still okay, that they're still basically at where they were back in 15 and 17, but they're still working these studies up, and they'll have a final decision by the end of 19. We're going to start talking in a minute about these three key cases that have got everyone's attention that have gone to verdict in California. But the EPA, when you're talking about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, the reason why we have this slide up is because during these trials, these first bellwether trials that went to verdict in California, the plaintiffs' experts conceded and agreed with the points that you see, that one of the main problems with trying to causally relate exposure to glyphosate Roundup with these health effects, primarily non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, is cross results, especially with pesticides, because pesticides have been known. There's a long documented history of pesticides in ag workers leading to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Also, smoking is a known cause for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And finally, that there's 75,000 new non-Hodgkin's lymphoma cases that are diagnosed every year in the US. and the vast majority of those are of unknown etiology, which means that even the experts and the doctors are saying, we're not sure, or we don't know what caused it. And yet, despite those admissions by plaintiffs' own experts, they still fall back to the IARC summary statement, and that's what fosters these lawsuits. The last bit is, we've been talking about the US, what about the EU? There was a study done by the European Food Safety Authority within the last year, I believe, and they issued a statement, the European Food Safety Authority, stating that use of Roundup on food products was, as you see there, quote, harmless, close quote. And the EU court ordered them to release all of their studies because they were, shall we say, surprised by that position by them. Now, turning to the Roundup litigation itself, the first case that went to verdict was Dwayne Johnson. Now, he was a maintenance man for a school district in California, and he worked at multiple like elementary and high school locations doing various maintenance man type duties to include spraying for weeds and clearing ball fields and that sort of thing. And he had had a many-year work occupational exposure to glyphosate, Roundup specifically. And even though he would use things like masks later on, early on he didn't use any masks or gloves, and even when he used gloves, he admitted that oftentimes he would wear short sleeve shirts and he would get the product spilled on his bare arms, etc. This came in, it was a big hit, 289 million. It was ultimately reduced to 78 million, where the court on review reduced the punitive award of 250 million down to match the compensatory award of 37 million. The claims in this case were traditional product liability, toxic tort, mass tort type legal theories, failure to warn, design defect, etc. But the whole theme and thread through these cases, and all these cases coming in the pipeline, is the reason for these big punitive damages verdicts, and that's because of these bad documents where Monsanto is alleged to have, in essence, cooked the books with some of these scientific studies that were done. The second case was in state court, in federal court. Johnson was state court. Hardiman was the first case to go to court in the federal MDL out in San Francisco. It's Judge Chabra out there who's running that program. And this was supposed to be the first of 3 bellwether trials that were scheduled by the judge to be tried essentially back to back. And the idea was that depending upon what the verdicts would be after those 3 trials, that they would then stop, take a pause, and see if they could go into global settlement negotiations. Well, once this case hit for as big as it did, then the Judge Chabria, the MDL judge, stopped any further trials, indefinitely stayed any further trials to allow the parties to enter into global settlement negotiation, if possible, at that point. One other thing to talk about, again, you see that it's an $81 million verdict, 75 million of it was punitives. So 6 million was compensatory. The other thing was that this was a bifurcated trial, which normally is believed to help the defense, but in that case, it didn't. And one of the main reasons was because of that issue I mentioned earlier about this argument, well, if you're saying that Roundup is bad because of the mix, then tell us what's in it so we can, fully vet the experts' opinions on both sides. Monsanto chose not to, and then the judge allowed all of the testimony to go in essence, unchecked. By the way, there was also an issue in Hardeman where he had chronic hepatitis C, and that's a known cause of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It came out in the trial, but it didn't prevent the experts testifying the way they did and the verdict such as it was. Piliad, which is really grabbed the attention of everyone because of the gigantic award, $2 billion plus compensatory. But again, as you see there, this is a husband and wife. They had a huge tract of land that they owned themselves, many years of heavy usage by the two of them on their own land of this weed killer agent. And they both developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma within 4 years of each other. They both went as joint plaintiffs to verdict, and they were each given $27.5 million compensatory and then $1 billion each. The plaintiff's attorney in closing said that there should be $1 billion punishment given to Monsanto because of their bad acts, and clearly the jury heard them. They not only did $1 billion, but they did $1 billion each. But one other thing that was interesting in that was that there was a request for a temporary restraining order in the case because there was claims by both sides that they were doing something called geofencing, where they were sending alerts and advertisements and studies to the smartphones of the jurors during the trial, and in essence trying to taint the jury pool. This, we talked about the three cases that have really gotten everyone's attention. This is where it's going. And in fact, this slide, which we just updated like yesterday, is already outdated. That 13,000 should now be 15,000. The 850 should be 1,100. And the 200 should be 300. Plus you've got the 3,000 in Missouri. And as many of you know, it's in St. Louis, which has the distinction of being one of those judicial hellholes. That may be why they're filed there. It also happens to be the corporate headquarters of Monsanto. There's also state court actions, and we've all seen the television ads. If you go on the internet, you'll see these ads as well. And if you put in, like, for example, right, Roundup, Pennsylvania, and it pops up a website and it links to the various plaintiffs groups. But if you then just put in Roundup, Florida, it pops up the exact same search hits with the same groups, but just steering them to the local firms handling this mass sign-up of these mass torts. There are also claims that are starting to expand beyond Monsanto and this mass tort personal injury litigation that we've been talking about. 6 states, as well as the federal court in Wisconsin, have various consumer group type litigation against not only manufacturers but distributors of the product. These primarily deal with consumer products, not with the Roundup products themselves, and they're more in the false advertising and mislabeling as safe to humans or organic, but perhaps they've been sprayed at the end of the growing process to be dried by glyphosate. And again, we mentioned the 2015 finding of probable carcinogen by the IARC that started this whole thing. This next slide really focuses on kind of the other side of this. So, if we're talking about the potential for, like, for example, golf courses and where this litigation is going, certainly we're talking not only about bodily injury and property damage claims, but traditional environmental claims, business interruption claims, because the inverse of these mass agribusiness growing fields are the organic growing fields. And to get an organic farm certification, you have to go at least 3 years proving your organic cleanness before you can get so certified. You have to be recertified annually, and you can lose this certification. And if you lose the certification, you then have to wait at least 3 to 5 more years again to get it back. And one of the ways to lose this certification is by wind drift or runoff or overspray from adjoining fields onto the organic fields. And that's why the USDA has developed these regs for buffer zones and good agri practices. This is just one example of those regs talking about diversion ditches and windbreaks, that sort of thing. And it's an attempt by the USDA to try to help both the non-organic farmers as well as the organic farmers to deal with and try to prevent some of these cross-contamination claims or spread to adjoining property type claims. So where is this going? We've talked about the class action lawsuits, but I think that it's not just the personal injury lawsuits, the mass torts that we see on TV every day, but potentially even more explosively, if my fear ends up being true that this is going to follow the asbestos model, then you can see take-home exposure claims, you can see cross-contamination claims, and especially if you have, using the example I gave earlier of the golf courses, then that involves various other aspects of insurance coverage claims and insurance litigation issues that we're going to talk about in a minute. The dead zones are something that is somewhat more as yet sci-fi fantasy rather than actual scientific reality. Again, it depends on what side of the fence you're on and whose experts you're relying on. But in essence, it talks about areas where, because of this contaminant being applied or being spread onto, nothing grows there, to include forests and everything else. Ultimately, where I think this might be headed is, as I mentioned, an asbestos model. You see on the screen, AM Best at the end of 2018 said that this may, if not properly managed and properly dealt with from a coverage perspective and an insurance perspective, could track and become the next asbestos and rising to the levels of asbestos type losses. And you see for the US insurers, that's $100 billion. And I believe that's just the US P&C market to date. I mean, dwarfing by more than twofold the other environmental losses. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tim Stalker.
Thanks, Rick. Rick has given you a lot of information, and what I want to do is cover the insurance coverage implications, and I think there are inevitable coverage issues going to be involved in this matter. Remember, already 15,000 plaintiffs already. Shock verdicts have come in. A product that is used over a number of years, just like asbestos, just like environmental, just like lead paint and other progressive injury type claims, there are going to be coverage implications. Certainly the policyholders aren't going to eat this all. They're going to look to maximize their coverage. So the first slide I have here is just a basic CGL coverage form. Consider this as a reference point. And as everyone knows, under the insuring agreement, the insurer agrees to pay damages because of bodily injury or property damage to which the insurance applies. It does not have to defend the insured against damages for which the bodily injury or property damage does not apply under the policy. And if we go to the next slide, the insurance only applies to bodily injury or property damage, basically if it occurs during the policy period. So again, no coverage if it doesn't occur during the policy period. There is coverage if the bodily injury or property damages occur during the policy period. And what is an occurrence? An occurrence, the bodily injury and property damage, again, have to arise out of an occurrence. An occurrence is generally defined as an accident, including continuous or repeated exposure to substantially the same general harmful condition. It has to be an accident. It can't be intentional conduct. It must be a fortuitous event. So if everyone recalls from environmental, from asbestos and other progressive injury type cases, there are multiple different coverage triggers depending upon what jurisdiction you're in. There's the exposure trigger, which is each policy on the risk during the time period where that plaintiff is actually exposed to the product is on the risk. So for someone who has used, let's say, Roundup for 20 years in an exposure jurisdiction like Alabama, Louisiana, and other states, each policy that was on the risk during that time period is potentially exposed. Manifestation, insurance policies on the risk at the date that the injury manifests itself or is diagnosed or becomes reasonably capable of medical diagnosis. In Pennsylvania, in some type of progressive injuries, they use a manifestation trigger. Injury in fact, basically, they look at the actual proof provided during the case to determine the date of injury. New York is well known for using an injury in fact trigger. And then the continuous trigger. And that's all policies on the risk from the date of exposure through the date of manifestation. We just heard about 3 cases in California. California uses a continuous trigger. New Jersey uses a continuous trigger. And Illinois as another example of a state that uses a continuous trigger. So you have, again, an issue of what is the occurrence, what is the date of injury, different triggering mechanisms depending upon the state. And then you get to the issue of how many occurrences are there? Is it a single occurrence or a multiple type occurrence? In some states, they will say it's a single occurrence, the exposure to this product. In other states, they take a multiple occurrence approach, which could be each time they went out and used the product, each batch of the product. It depends upon how the estate looks at the underlying fortuitous event. Duty to defend. Although the law in each state is different, generally the duty to defend is broader than the duty to indemnify. So if you have a policyholder that has this product, they're going to look for a defense, and you may want to reserve your rights, but you, as an insurance carrier, but your obligation to defend is broader than your duty to indemnify. Ultimately, you may not have to indemnify, but until you make that determination, in most states, you have an obligation to defend. And all of us who have been involved in environmental, asbestos, and other progressive injury type cases know that the cost to defend is generally multiples over the indemnity cost. And then accompanying the duty to defend is the allocation of loss or defense costs. There's the bathtub approach used in lots of states like New Jersey, where basically the underlying carriers have to meet their obligation before moving into the umbrella or excess carrier's obligation to provide a defense or allocation of loss. There are also states where if the carriers can't agree on who's going to defend, the insured can choose what year to have its defense costs paid or its loss paid, and then it's up to the carriers to allocate among themselves. So you have multiple approaches on the allocation of loss. That's why now in many of the asbestos cases remaining, there are cost-sharing agreements, but like the early days of asbestos and environmental and lead, I think there's going to be some fighting among the carriers on who's going to provide a defense in this case, particularly if you're looking at billions of dollars being paid, because the insureds, the policyholders, can't foot the bill. They believe they have coverage for this product, and they're going to look at the carriers to provide them not only defense but indemnity. So just back to slide, the potential coverage defenses very similar to asbestos. Again, that's I put the CGL slide up earlier. It has to be an occurrence, a fortuitous event during the policy period. So one of the defenses is, hey, it wasn't an accident, it wasn't fortuitous, and it wasn't during our policy period. Look somewhere else for coverage. It was an expected or intended injury. What knowledge did Monsanto have, or some of the other distributors, regarding the tendencies of this product to cause injury? What tests did they have? What is their internal documentation? So say, hey, you know what? This is excluded because the results were an expected or intended injury, or it was a known loss. And as everyone, again, who has been involved in this area, sometimes the courts will look to intent, whether the insured actually knew this, or whether it was intentional, or whether it was a subjective intent. So look at both sides of that. And whether the pollution exclusion applies to this. So all the policies, or at least the vast majority of the policies, contain pollution exclusions. I suspect that this exclusion will be tested just because of the potential enormity of this litigation. Each of the three cases you heard earlier resulted in punitive damages being assessed in California, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. There's no coverage for directly assessed punitive damages. It's against public policy. So those three results you saw out there from Monsanto, in my view, there's no coverage for the punitive damages because it's against public policy to provide coverage for a directly assessed punitive damages. And late notice. I suspect that many carriers will look at the notice that they receive, and they have to assess whether notice was provided timely. Okay, not only does this have implications for insurance companies, it also has potential implications for reinsurers. And just briefly, as most of you know, reinsurance is insurance of insurance companies. There are many different types of reinsurance, but some of the main types are facultative, where a reinsurer will reinsure a specific risk. A good example would be Yankee Stadium. A treaty reinsurance is where a reinsurer will insure a book of business, could be a casualty book of business, And a third type, a well-known type, is catastrophe, where reinsurance is provided to cover either a natural or man-made catastrophe like hurricanes or earthquakes. And just to give an example of an insurer, I mean, Nationwide, Chubb, Liberty Mutual are insurers, and sometimes they do act as reinsurers. And the well-known reinsurers are like Munich Re, Hanover Re, and the London Market. The relationship between insurer and reinsurer is a little bit different than an insurer and policyholder. The relationship has been described as one of utmost good faith between both the reinsurer and the insurer or cedant. And that relationship, again, is reciprocal, and there's a good deal of cooperation expected from both parties. Next slide. Generally, the reinsurer has to follow the good faith settlements of the ceding company, where this, again, where the slide says, where the ceding company has acted in good faith. That's the general principle. And a reinsurer is bound also only if the allocation to the reinsurance agreement is objectively reasonable. So generally, utmost good faith, reinsurer has to follow the settlements. But if the reinsurer can show that the allocation was not reasonable or in bad faith, or the ceding company has not allocated in compliance with the reinsurance agreement, then the reinsurer has a defense to the loss settlement. Slide. So, as I indicated, some reinsurance implications with progressive injury type cases like this one. Is the presentation reasonable? Was coverage triggered under the policy reinsured by the reinsurance agreement? And is the ceding company attempting to unreasonably maximize its reinsurance coverage? For example, suppose a policyholder had a 3-year policy with annual payment of premium. If some large settlements were made in this particular case, did they try to recover from the reinsurer, did they put it all in 1 year? Should the settlement be allocated among the 3 policy years? So those are things that a reinsurer will look to see if the ceding company, the insurer, is acting on a reasonable basis. They'll also look to see how they're historically billing the reinsurer on these types of cases. Are they trying to maximizing it to 1 year, or are they trying to and doing it differently the next time they get a loss? So they'll look at the pattern of the insurer. Are there potential exclusions under the reinsurance agreement, or the exclusions under the reinsurance agreement the same as under the policy? Is the reinsurance agreement tracking the policy, or do you have separate exclusions under the reinsurance agreement? And does the reinsurance agreement cover bad faith and any losses in excess of policy limits? Most agreements now do cover bad faith and XPL, but you have to make sure. And again, with reinsurers, most reinsurers take the position if punitive damages are not insurable in a particular jurisdiction, they're not reinsurable. And there is no coverage. There's long history of law regarding ex gratia payments by an insurer. The reinsurance agreements do not cover ex gratia payments or policies or payments beyond the terms of the policy. So that is a quick summary of potential coverage issues, both on an insurance and reinsurance basis. We would like to thank you for attending our webinar, Fallout from the Monsanto Roundup Verdicts, Present and Future Impact of Glyphosate. and health risks, litigation, and coverage issues. You can learn more about this program and all other Weber Gallagher events by visiting our website at wglaw.com. And Rick and I would like to thank you for your attendance today.